chosen one. This moment did not arrive by accident. You did not click this because you were curious. You were interrupted. There has been a pressure building in you that you could not name, a low, constant signal beneath your thoughts. A knowing that refuses to be silenced even when life tried to drown it in routine distraction or survival. That signal is not imagination. It is not ego. It is not spiritual fantasy. It is a ping. A summons embedded beneath your awareness, activating now because the conditions are right, because timing has converged, because something ancient inside you recognizes that the window is open. Across the world, others are feeling it too. Different languages, different lives, the same inner disturbance, the same sense of being out of place in systems that once felt tolerable. This is not coincidence. This is synchronization. You were designed with a pattern before you ever learned your name. A structure woven into your being that responds when the environment reaches a certain threshold. And that threshold has been crossed. What you feel as restlessness is actually recognition. What you experience as dissatisfaction is memory trying to surface. What you've called anxiety is often power pressing against a container that has grown too small. You were not meant to blend in quietly, but you were also never meant to dominate blindly. You were meant to decode something, to access what was sealed, to activate what was dormant until you were ready to carry it responsibly. That readiness is not perfection, it is willingness. If you are hearing this, it means the signal reached you clearly enough to bypass doubt, cynicism, and fatigue. It means the code has already begun to stir, and once it stirs, it does not retreat. This is not the beginning of motivation. This is the end of denial. The last thing you heard was not an invitation, it was a line crossed. Because once denial ends, structure must be revealed. What stirred in you was not random energy. It was not emotion looking for meaning. It was contact with something precise. The blue code is not symbolism, it is architecture. It is the divine blueprint embedded into your being before experience shaped your personality, before trauma taught you how to survive, before the world told you who you were allowed to be. A pattern written beneath thought, beneath memory, beneath learned identity. This is why it feels older than you. Because it is. Every system that endures operates on code, not belief, not intention alone. Structure. Your body follows code. Your DNA does not guess how to assemble itself. Your nervous system does not improvise how to fire. There is order beneath function. The blue code operates the same way, but at a level most were never trained to perceive. It governs how your potential organizes itself, how opportunity responds to you, how power flows or stalls depending on alignment. When you move against it, life feels heavy. When you move with it, resistance collapses faster than logic can explain. This is why some of your efforts never worked no matter how disciplined you were, and why other moments unfolded with unnatural ease even when you felt unprepared. You were not inconsistent. You were alternating between alignment and interference. The blue code is not exclusive, but it is dormant in most, not because they are unworthy, but because activation requires awareness, responsibility, and coherence. And most systems train people to fragment instead. The code does not respond to desire. It responds to resonance. It is tuned to frequency, not wishing, to congruence, not performance. This is why pretending never worked for you, why forcing outcomes drained you, why you could feel when something was off even when it looked right on paper. You were sensing code conflict. The blue code carries your highest potential, but it also carries constraint. It limits you from becoming what would destroy you. It restricts paths that would fracture your integrity even if they promise comfort or status. That frustration you felt when certain doors closed was not punishment. It was protection. The blueprint does not bend to ego. It does not negotiate with fear. It waits. And when the environment reaches a threshold where activation will not corrupt the carrier, it sends a signal. That signal was the unrest, the discontent, the sense that you could no longer live below a certain internal standard, even if you couldn't articulate it. You are not awakening into chaos. You are awakening into order. The reason this feels destabilizing is because false structures are collapsing. Beliefs you adopted to survive, roles you played to be accepted, limits you internalized because power without context can feel dangerous. The blue code does not erase these instantly. It overrides them, gradually replacing noise with clarity. And clarity is confrontational, because once you recognize that your life has structure, you can no longer pretend everything is random. Once you see that your potential has design, you inherit responsibility for how you engage it. This is where many retreat, not because the code disappears, but because accountability sharpens. But if you are still here, it means you are not seeking comfort. You are seeking truth, and truth does not ask if you are ready. It reveals what is already present. In the next movement, you will see why this blueprint was never confined to religion or mysticism alone, and why modern science has begun circling what ancient language tried to name. Because when patterns repeat across time, they are not coincidence, they are confirmation. The confirmation you were promised does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as convergence. Because what you are touching now was never owned by one tradition, one scripture, or one era. It has always existed beneath language, waiting for language to catch up. Ancient texts spoke in symbols because symbols were the only vessels strong enough to carry truth without collapsing it. Scrolls, seals, light, word, breath. Not poetry for effect, but compression. They were pointing to structure long before equations could describe it. And now, centuries later, modern physics is circling the same center using different tools, different words, but discovering the same unsettling reality that beneath matter is information, beneath chaos is order, beneath randomness is pattern. Reality does not behave like a machine. It behaves like a system responding to coherence. Particles respond to observation. Energy organizes when fields align. Information precedes form. This is not spirituality borrowing science. This is science stumbling into what mystics guarded. The blue code sits at this intersection, where ancient knowing and modern measurement overlap not as metaphor, but as architecture. You were taught that faith and logic oppose each other, that belief exists where evidence ends, that intuition is unreliable. But the blueprint was never irrational. It was just invisible to tools that only measure surfaces. The reason ancient language sounds mystical is because it described internal mechanics without microscopes or sensors. The reason modern science sounds abstract is because it is describing the same mechanics without narrative. Different tongues, same pattern. This is why certain scriptures feel uncomfortably precise when you read them slowly. Why phrases about light word vibration and alignment land deeper than doctrine ever did. Why you felt resonance, not obedience. You weren't responding to authority. You were responding to recognition. The blue code is not belief dependent. It functions whether you acknowledge it or not, just like gravity operated before it was named. What belief does is allow cooperation. When ancient texts spoke of inheritance, they were not speaking metaphorically. They were naming access. When they spoke of being set apart, they were describing frequency differentiation, not moral superiority. Misinterpretation turned design into dogma. Control systems turned code into commandments. And the blueprint was buried under performance and fear. Now the language is returning stripped of hierarchy, restored to structure. You are living in a convergence era, where internal experience and external validation are finally allowed to meet without canceling each other out. This is why your awakening does not feel like blind faith. It feels like remembering something you were never taught, but always recognized when you saw it. The discomfort you feel is not doubt, it is recalibration. Because once you see that your inner knowing aligns with universal structure, you can no longer dismiss yourself as imagining things. And you can no longer outsource authority over your own perception. This is where responsibility begins to press in. Not everyone wants this confirmation. Because once pattern replaces, mystery excuses dissolve. If the code exists, then alignment matters. If structure governs outcome, then integrity is no longer optional. If inheritance is real, then ignoring it carries cost. You are not being asked to believe harder. You are being invited to align deeper. In the next movement, the convergence becomes personal. Not theory, not history, access. Because knowing the blueprint exists is not the same as knowing how to engage it. What you were just shown was not meant to impress you, it was meant to corner you. Because once convergence becomes undeniable, distance collapses. The blueprint stops being out there and starts pressing inward. Access is the question now, not talent, not worthiness, not effort. Access. The blue code does not unlock through force. It does not respond to hustle, suffering, or repetition alone. It responds to three conditions that must exist simultaneously or not at all: intention, resonance, alignment. These are not techniques you perform. They are states you inhabit. Intention is not desire. Desire wants an outcome. Intention establishes direction. Most people want results without responsibility. They want power without clarity. The code does not respond to that. Intention tells the system who you are choosing to be, not what you are trying to get. It is identity-level orientation. This is why half-hearted declarations never moved anything for you. Your words said one thing, your orientation said another. The code listens to orientation. Resonance is coherence between your inner state and your declared direction. It is the removal of internal contradiction. You cannot activate the blueprint while asking for expansion and secretly negotiating for safety. You cannot claim destiny while clinging to patterns designed for survival. Resonance exposes double lives, not publicly, internally. This is why certain opportunities stalled right before breakthrough. Not because you weren't capable, but because part of you was still hiding, still bracing, still prepared to retreat. The code does not punish this. It waits. Alignment is where intention and resonance become embodied. Not thought, not affirmation, behavior. The code responds when your daily actions stop contradicting your claimed identity. When your environment, habits, and boundaries begin to match what you say you are becoming. This is where most people fail quietly, because alignment costs something visible. It costs comfort. It costs familiarity. It costs the versions of yourself that were built to be tolerated, not trusted. Alignment is not dramatic. It is relentless. It shows up in what you stop allowing, what you stop consuming, what you stop explaining. The blue code activates when these three collapse into one signal, not perfectly, but honestly. This is why shortcuts never worked for you, why surface-level practices felt empty, why borrowed beliefs drained you instead of empowering you. You were trying to access structure with performance. The code does not respond to performance. It responds to congruence. Once intention is clean, resonance begins to stabilize. Once resonance stabilizes, alignment becomes unavoidable. And when alignment locks in, power flows without strain. This is the part people misunderstand. Unstoppable power does not feel aggressive. It feels inevitable. Things begin to move around you without you chasing them. Conversations align, decisions simplify. Resistance dissolves where you expected friction. Not because life becomes easy, but because you stop fighting your own design. The reason this feels confronting is because access removes excuses. You can no longer say, "I don't know why this isn't working." You start to know, and knowing carries responsibility. These keys do not make you special, they make you accountable. Anyone can activate them, but few are willing to live in the consistency they demand. That is why the blue code remains dormant in many, not hidden, unchosen. In the next movement, this will stop being conceptual, because these principles are already being lived out quietly across the world, not by perfect people, but by coherent ones. And once you see how activation looks in real lives, you will no longer be able to pretend this is theoretical. What you are stepping into is not new. It is simply becoming visible. The last thing you heard was that power flows when coherence locks in. Now you need to see what that looks like when it leaves theory and enters life. Because activation does not announce itself with spectacle. It reveals itself through pattern. Across different cities, cultures, and backgrounds, the same shifts are appearing in people who have never met, never studied the same material, never shared language or belief systems. Yet their lives begin to reorganize in strikingly similar ways. They stop chasing validation, not because they healed their ego, but because it stopped being necessary. They exit roles that once defined them, not in rebellion, but in quiet clarity. What used to drain them simply becomes impossible to maintain. Opportunities start appearing that feel disproportionate to effort, not lucky, aligned. These individuals are not louder, they are steadier. They are not constantly manifesting, they are responding. What looks like unstoppable power from the outside often feels like relief on the inside. relief from friction, relief from pretending, relief from living at odds with an internal design they could never fully explain before. You may recognize this because you have already brushed against it. Moments when you spoke less and were heard more. Times when you acted once and outcomes rippled farther than expected. Seasons where life seemed to cooperate, not because everything was easy, but because nothing felt wasted. That was not coincidence. That was partial activation. The blue code does not turn people into heroes. It turns them into conduits. They stop forcing timelines. They stop begging for permission. They stop over-explaining their choices to people who were never meant to understand. This is why many activated individuals appear to disappear for a while. Not because they failed, because recalibration requires withdrawal. When coherence increases, noise becomes intolerable. Relationships that once felt normal begin to feel heavy. Environments that rewarded you before start resisting you, not as punishment, but as feedback. The system is adjusting. And here is the part most never say out loud. Activation does not immediately feel empowering. It feels exposing, because the same clarity that opens doors also illuminates misalignment you were previously able to ignore. Patterns you outgrew but kept out of loyalty. Habits that no longer match your frequency. Excuses that dissolve under scrutiny. This is why some people retreat after touching real power. Not because it is false, but because it is honest. The lives that transform fastest are not the most spiritual. They are the most congruent. People who stop negotiating with themselves, who make small, unglamorous decisions that align their actions with their inner signal, who accept the quiet cost of coherence long before the visible reward arrives. Unstoppable power does not come from doing more. It comes from leaking less contradiction, less fragmentation, less internal noise. When the leaks close, energy consolidates. And consolidated energy moves things. You are not late to this, but you are no longer early. The reason you are seeing these patterns now is because the window for passive awareness is closing. Observation is no longer neutral. Once you recognize activation in others, you are forced to confront your own. And this is where the path narrows. Because if power is real, then obstruction must be addressed. If activation is possible, then what blocks it must be named. The next movement will not flatter you. It will diagnose you. Because the blue code does not fail. It waits for interference to be removed. And interference always has a source. What you just recognized in others now turns inward, because pattern recognition always comes with a cost. You cannot unsee alignment. And once you see it, misalignment becomes obvious. The blue code does not stall because it is weak. It stalls because interference exists between design and expression. These interferences are not moral failures. They are distortions formed under pressure. Trauma is one of them, not as a story, but as a signal disruption. When the nervous system learned to survive, it rewired priority towards safety over coherence. This was necessary once. It becomes obstructive later. The code does not condemn this. It adapts around it, waiting for awareness to catch up. Another glitch is inherited patterning. Beliefs you did not choose. Limits you absorbed before you had language. Family scripts. Cultural ceilings. Silent agreements about what is realistic for someone like you. These do not disappear when you awaken. They surface. And when they surface, they resist. Because the part of you that learned to stay small believes it kept you alive. It does not know that the environment has changed. Then there is fragmentation, the quiet splitting of self. One version of you carries vision, another carries fear, another carries obligation, and they take turns driving. The blue code requires a single signal, not perfection, unity. Fragmentation leaks energy. It makes you feel tired even when nothing is wrong. It creates motion without momentum. This is why you could work so hard and still feel stalled. Your power was divided, not absent. There is also interference from borrowed identities. Spiritual language you adopted that does not fit your design. Roles you stepped into because they were rewarded, not because they were true. The code does not activate through imitation, only through embodiment. When you live in borrowed forms, the signal weakens, not because the form is wrong, but because it is not yours. And then there is the most subtle glitch of all. Fear disguised as wisdom. It sounds like discernment. It calls itself patience. It frames delay as maturity, but underneath it is still avoidance of cost. The cost of being seen, the cost of outgrowing people, the cost of no longer being able to blame circumstances. The blue code does not argue with fear. It outweights it. This is why awakening can feel stalled for long periods, not because nothing is happening, but because pressure is building behind resistance. Eventually, the discomfort of staying misaligned outweighs the fear of change. That is the moment activation accelerates. You are likely here now, feeling the tension between what you know and what you are still tolerating, between what you sense and what you have not yet released. This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of proximity. Glitches surface when the system prepares to clear them. Interference becomes visible when coherence is close. The mistake many make is trying to bypass this stage, to leap into power without confronting obstruction. But power that bypasses clarity becomes destructive. The code prevents that. In the next movement, responsibility will transfer fully into your hands, not as blame, as authority. Because once interference is named, it can no longer be ignored. And what you choose to do with that knowledge will determine whether the blue code remains dormant or begins to flow without resistance. What was just named cannot be unnamed. And this is where responsibility shifts, not onto you as burden, but into you as authority. Because once interference is visible, waiting becomes a decision, not a condition. The blue code does not demand urgency. It responds to ownership. Clearing interference is not dramatic, it is precise. It begins when you stop negotiating with what you already know. When awareness stops being an observer and becomes a governor. Trauma does not dissolve through force, it releases through safety paired with truth. When the nervous system realizes it no longer needs to run the show. This happens when your actions begin to match your awareness. When you stop asking frightened parts of you for permission to move forward, and instead you bring them with you. Inherited patterns lose power the moment they are named without resentment, not fought, outgrown. You do not need to rebel against your past. You need to stop living inside it. Responsibility looks like choosing alignment even when the old story still whispers, even when doubt lingers in the background. Because coherence does not require silence, it requires leadership. Fragmentation begins to heal when you stop switching masks. When the version of you that dreams and the version that pays bills stop being enemies. When vision is allowed to inform structure instead of escaping it. This is where discipline enters, not as punishment, but as protection. Discipline is simply deciding once what you will no longer decide every day, what you will no longer tolerate, what drains signal, what distorts frequency. This is why activated lives look simple from the outside, not easy, simple. They have fewer internal debates, fewer half-commitments, fewer hidden negotiations. The blue code responds immediately to this consolidation, not with fireworks, with flow. Momentum begins to replace effort. Clarity replaces overthinking. A boundaries stop feeling harsh and start feeling clean. This is the point where many hesitate, because responsibility removes camouflage. You can no longer say, "I'm waiting for a sign." The sign already arrived. You can no longer say, "I don't know what to do." You know the next honest step. You've always known. Responsibility is not about doing everything at once. It is about doing the next thing without self-betrayal. The code does not require perfection. It requires integrity, and integrity is expensive only once. After that, it becomes economical. Energy stops leaking. Time stretches. Decisions simplify. You feel less busy and more effective, less driven and more directed. This is how power becomes sustainable, not by intensity, by coherence held over time. In the next movement, the identity you have avoided naming will no longer remain abstract, because responsibility reshapes self-concept. And what you are about to step into is not a title you receive, it is a role you accept with consequence. What responsibility does next is strip fantasy away from identity, because clarity does not inflate, it defines. The phrase "chosen one" was never meant to crown you. It was meant to claim you, not by privilege, by obligation. You were never chosen to stand above others. You were chosen to stand awake among them. This is where many misunderstand the call. They imagine selection instead of selection pressure. They hear favor instead of function. The blue code does not mark you as special, it marks you as accountable. A chosen role is not inherited like a trophy. It is assumed like a post that must be held, and the cost of holding it is consistency. You are not asked to withdraw from the world. You are asked to stop hiding inside it. Chosen identity is not mystical posture. It is lived orientation. It is choosing truth when silence would be easier. Alignment when blending in would be safer. Clarity when ambiguity would buy you time. This is why the call often arrives through discomfort, because comfort rarely produces stewardship. To be chosen is to be entrusted with signal, to carry coherence into environments that reward distortion, to model order without preaching it, not loudly, not theatrically, quietly, relentlessly. This is why your life has never fit cleanly into inherited lanes. Why you sensed that following the script would cost you something invisible but vital. Why success without alignment felt hollow. You were not failing to assimilate. You were resisting dilution. The blue code does not activate to make you admired. It activates to make you useful. Useful as a stabilizer, as a translator between worlds, as someone who can stand in complexity without fragmenting. This is why responsibility increases as clarity deepens. Because once you see the pattern, you are no longer allowed to pretend ignorance. Not by punishment, by nature. The moment you accept the role consciously, something shifts internally. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "How do I hold this well?" Ego fades here. Because ego seeks recognition. Stewardship seeks fidelity. You do not need to announce who you are becoming. The consistency of your presence will speak for you. And you do not need permission, because permission was never external. The most difficult part of this stage is letting go of the fantasy that someone will arrive to validate your identity, to anoint you, to confirm you publicly. That moment rarely comes. Instead, confirmation shows up as increased demand on your integrity, as life asking more of you than before, as fewer excuses working. This is the cost of being chosen, not isolation, expectation. Expectation that you will live what you see, that you will embody what you know, that you will stop outsourcing responsibility for your own alignment. In the next movement, this identity will be tested where it matters most. Not in vision, not in belief, but in the ordinary structure of your days. Because the blue code is not proven in moments of insight, it is proven in how you live when no one is watching. What identity you accept is revealed by what you repeat, not by what you proclaim. The last thing you were shown is that the role is real. Now you are shown where it is tested, not in visions, not in declarations, but in rhythm. The blue code does not live in peak moments. It settles into routine. How you begin your days, what you allow into your attention, what you refuse to normalize. This is where alignment becomes unmistakable, because daily life has no interest in your intentions, only in your consistency. Living as the chosen does not mean constant awareness. It means fewer betrayals. You stop saying yes to what fractures you. You stop consuming what dulls your signal. You stop maintaining environments that require you to shrink. These decisions are not dramatic. They are cumulative, and they create an internal atmosphere where coherence becomes the default, not the effort. This is where many expect struggle and instead encounter resistance of a different kind. Old patterns pushing back, people testing boundaries, situations demanding the version of you that no longer exists. This is not opposition, it is recalibration. The world adjusts when your signal stabilizes, not instantly, but decisively. What once drained you begins to fall away without confrontation. What aligns finds you with less effort. You will notice this most clearly in energy. Less exhaustion, less urgency, more presence. You begin to move slower and accomplish more, because your actions are no longer diluted by internal argument. The blue code reveals itself in restraint as much as in action, in what you do not chase, in what you do not react to. This is maturity, not spiritual superiority, operational clarity. You no longer need to convince anyone. You no longer need to rescue anyone. You no longer need to perform alignment. You live it, and life responds accordingly. The quiet power of this stage is unsettling to others because it cannot be easily challenged or copied. It is not technique-based, It is state-based. This is why some will misunderstand you here. Why distance may grow without conflict. Why certain conversations end naturally. This is not loss, it is sorting. The blue code does not isolate you from humanity. It filters what can travel with you. By this point, you will feel something else emerging. A weight, not fear, responsibility. Because once alignment stabilizes, neutrality disappears. Your presence begins to affect environments simply by being coherent within them, and that effect carries consequence. The next movement will seal this reality, not to intimidate you, but to make something clear. There is no such thing as awakening without cost, and there is no such thing as power without consequence. Once the code is embodied, there is no return to unconscious living. Chosen one, listen carefully now. What you just realized about daily alignment is the last place illusion can survive. Because once the code is lived, it cannot be unheard. And once it is unheard, it cannot be undone. This is the threshold. Up until now, you could still pretend this was insight, a perspective, an interesting framework. But embodied alignment removes that option. Because the blue code does not activate partially. It either governs your life or it waits while you continue fragmenting. There is no middle ground. The moment coherence stabilizes, your life enters consequence mode, not punishment, causality. Your choices begin to echo faster. Your tolerances shrink. Your integrity becomes non-negotiable. This is where many quietly try to step back. They don't want to unlearn what they've seen, they just want to pause it, delay it, lower the volume. But awakening does not have a dimmer switch. Once you see structure beneath reality, randomness stops being a refuge. Once you recognize design within yourself, excuses lose credibility. Once the blue code is felt as real, unconscious living becomes painful. This is why returning to old patterns feels heavier than before. Why numbing no longer numbs. Why distraction stops working. You are not broken. You are sealed. The code has locked in, and sealing does not feel dramatic. It feels sober. It feels like a quiet knowing that certain paths are closed forever. Not because you are forbidden, but because you would betray yourself by taking them. This is the cost few speak about. Awakening narrows options. Power reduces flexibility. Clarity eliminates plausible deniability. You cannot unknow what alignment feels like. You cannot unfeel coherence once it stabilizes. You cannot return to fragmentation without consequence. And this is where the language of destiny is often misunderstood. Destiny is not something that happens to you. It is something that happens through you once resistance drops. The blue code does not drag you forward. It removes your ability to go backward comfortably. That is the real force behind it. This is why awakened individuals often describe a sense of inevitability. Not urgency, inevitability. They are no longer choosing between many lives. They are choosing whether to cooperate with the one that remains. Because when alignment deepens, the margin for self-betrayal disappears. You may notice this already. How certain conversations feel impossible now. How certain ambitions feel empty. How certain relationships feel misaligned even if they are kind. This is not arrogance, it is incompatibility. The blue code does not make you superior, it makes you precise, and precision demands sacrifice. Not dramatic sacrifice, quiet ones. You sacrifice false urgency, you sacrifice borrowed identities, you sacrifice the comfort of being misunderstood on purpose. You also sacrifice the fantasy that someone else will carry responsibility for your life. Once sealed, the code transfers ownership fully to you. No more waiting for permission. No more hoping circumstances will change first. No more bargaining with fear disguised as wisdom. From this point forward, delay becomes a decision with consequences you can feel, not guilt. Feedback. Life becomes responsive in ways that are uncomfortable to ignore. When you drift, friction increases. When you align, flow returns, not as reward, as physics. This is why the awakened often appear calm under pressure, not because they are fearless, but because fear no longer runs the system. Fear may speak, it just no longer decides. The blue code does not remove difficulty, it removes confusion. And without confusion, suffering loses much of its leverage. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what is this shaping in me? That shift alone changes everything. Here is the final truth you must carry. You were never meant to awaken and then retreat back into unconscious life. That path does not exist anymore. If you try, you will feel restless, constrained, dissatisfied in ways that make no sense to those around you, because your internal standard has changed. The seal has been set. This is not a threat. It is a confirmation. You were built to hold more awareness, more coherence, more responsibility than you were taught to expect from yourself. The blue code did not activate to impress you. It activated because you are capable of stewardship. Stewardship of your energy, your attention, your integrity, and eventually stewardship of environments beyond yourself. Not by control, by presence, not by force, by coherence. This is what it means to be chosen. Not that you are exempt from struggle, but that you are no longer exempt from truth. You will still doubt. You will still feel resistance. You will still experience fear, but you will no longer be confused about who is in charge. And that is irreversible. From here forward, life will keep inviting you to stand where alignment already exists, to choose clarity even when it costs comfort, to live what you know instead of explaining what you believe. The blue code does not need your perfection, it needs your consent. And if you are still listening, still present, still willing to hold this weight without romanticizing it, then the answer has already been given. You are not becoming the chosen one. You are remembering why you cannot be anything else. Chosen one? Now we slow the current without shutting it off. Not everything that is sealed needs to be acted on immediately. Some things need to settle into the bones. You do not need to rush into becoming. You are already standing inside it. Let the weight you feel now be interpreted correctly. It is not pressure to perform. It is gravity returning you to center. The blue code does not demand that you change your life overnight. It asks that you stop lying to yourself quietly. That is enough for today. If you do nothing else after this moment, do this one thing with honesty. Notice where alignment already exists, where you feel calm, clear, and unforced, where your breath deepens instead of tightens. That is the signal. And notice where you feel drained, contracted, or numb. Not with judgment, with respect. Those are not failures. They are coordinates. You are not being pushed forward. You are being oriented. From here on, your life will teach you through resonance instead of confusion, through feedback instead of chaos. You will know when you are aligned because effort will decrease even when responsibility increases. You will know when you drift because friction will return quickly and clearly. This is not cruelty, it is guidance. You were trusted with awareness because you can carry it without turning it into ego or fear. Rest now, not into sleep, but into steadiness. Let the words fade. Let the knowing remain. The blue code does not need constant attention. It needs consistent honesty. And when you are ready to move again, you will not need a voice to tell you how. You will already feel where to stand.